Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we are so thrilled that you could join us today. We're going to be talking about a number of religious liberty cases, all wins for First Amendment religious liberty kinds of conversation. I'll chat about this for a little bit, and of course, I would imagine that Kelly Shackelford, Lathan Watts are certainly excited about talking about that tomorrow. Jackie Deason will be with us in that last hour on Friday when we do our Millennial Roundtable, so we're going to get quite a bit of perspective on some of the things that are happening. And these religious liberty cases aren't just from the Supreme Court. There's a religious liberty case today. It comes from the Navy, so that's pretty intriguing, to say the least. Then I thought we might talk a little bit about the ongoing battle over the pandemic. You did notice that the Texas State Fair has been canceled. Okay, in case you have not, that is the case. And then the mayor of Houston decided to cancel the Republican State Convention in Houston. So a lot of things that people thought would happen are not. Very good piece that came out a while back, and I've been kind of waiting to talk about this. It's COVID-19 is here to stay. People will have to adapt. And that's been kind of my philosophy ever since we really sort of understood the nature of the coronavirus. And so that's one of those things that we're going to have to live with for some time, I suspect. Let's also mention that next hour, I'll get into a couple more of these Supreme Court cases, maybe in some more detail, get into a few of the commentaries that I've been posting. The one today is on Tifa. But then we'll be talking with James Hirsen, we hope. Last time he wasn't able to make the program, and that happens from time to time. But he has a piece called The Church of Woke. And then I also asked Karen if maybe she'd post this other piece on the fragility of woke, which is actually a Victor Davis Hanson piece, and whether he talks about it or I talk about it when he's gone, we'll figure that out. And then we're going to have Stephen Baskerville with us. He has written a very good piece, joining us from England, by the way, today, Conservative Diffidence and the Political Exploitation of George Floyd. So that's just a brief overview of all the kinds of things we're going to talk about over a 3-hour period. I recognize most of you listening this hour on radio, unless you go on the computer, will not hear that third hour. But it is something we broadcast to the national audience, and if you would like to hear it, you are welcome to do so. Let's talk about some of these religious liberty victories, and this one comes from the Wall Street Journal, and I've got our good friend John Stonestreet who's written about it from Breakpoint. But as the editors say of Wall Street Journal, religious Americans sometimes fear that intolerant secular progressives will soon try to ruin them by holding traditional views. They can take heart in a pair of 7-2 rulings on Wednesday from the Supreme Court, in which the justices upheld conscience protections for nuns and parochial schools. Let's take the parochial school first. This is the Our Lady of Guadalupe School. And it had a situation which had 2 teachers who were removed from positions, and they sued for discrimination because their contracts were not renewed because they, in one way or another, disagreed either verbally or even in terms of lifestyle with the views of that parochial school. Now, if you think about that, back in 2012, if you've listened to this program, we talked about the Hosanna Tabor case, in which this was a 4th grade teacher that wanted to sue the Lutheran school, and she was covered covered by what's called a ministerial exemption, based on the First Amendment right of churches to be free of government meddling. And the question has always been, does a religious school or a religious organization have the right to select who they want to be in positions of authority? You would think that the answer to that question would be pretty simple, right? Not necessarily, because, of course, the government can meddle in secular institutions all the time, saying that you don't have a right to say that you want only straight people, or you only want individuals that are all Catholic in your business. That's not the way the game's played. There's an equal opportunity. But when you talk about a religious school that is teaching religious doctrine, do you have a right to determine whether or not that person agrees with that doctrine? And here's the other part of it, whether that person's lifestyle upholds that doctrine. And you can kind of see where that takes us pretty quickly. And of course, now in light of the other decision that we talked about, the Bostock case, which had to do with extending federal anti-discrimination laws to sexual orientation and transgender status, is it not possible then that somebody could say, look, that person's teaching math and also gay, and we should not tell them that they cannot teach that because their, if you will, personal lifestyle or even views on human sexuality doesn't show up in a math class. Well, again, the ruling seems to suggest so far that indeed that would be under the authority of a Christian school or a parochial school. And back to that Bostock case, you remember Neil Gorsuch at the time said, well, there's maybe a question for future cases, and there will be some of those. But nevertheless, the ruling 7-2 was pretty clear, and that is, if you're a religious school, if you're a religious organization, if you're a church, you have a right to determine who's going to be in positions of leadership, who's going to teach, who's going to be in the pastorate, those kinds of things. And the second decision, which I'll mention real quickly, almost shouldn't even be mentioned, but it is, and that is it's the Little Sisters of the Poor. And you might be going, not them again. Yes, them again. Because, of course, during the Obama administration, we had what is called the Affordable Care Act, or oftentimes called Obamacare. And the little nuns actually... Little Sisters, I should say, Little Sisters of the Poor, to get it correctly, these Catholic nuns said, we just cannot in good conscience have any funds going to abortion or contraception. And so the order was pretty much run through and agreed that that would not apply to Little Sisters of the Poor, would not apply to Hobby Lobby and others. And so then the Trump administration put forth regulations in 2017 and 2018 to expand the exemption for employers with good faith objections, and you would have thought that was enough. Oh, no. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the state of New Jersey sued, calling that an abuse of discretion. And so, again, we had a ruling coming down from Justice Clarence Thomas, along with the other conservatives on the court, so it was a 5-4 case, which, again, established this. And it is always amazing that even though it's a narrow case, you have some of these other comments by Justice Kagan and Breyer, who I would have thought might have joined along, but did not. But we'll get more into those issues a little bit later, especially on Friday, maybe even in the next hour. But when we come back, I'll give you just a real quick summary of what John Stonestreet said about those two cases. Then I want to move on to another case that came out of the Navy. I was going to talk about it today, and it's already been resolved. And that's really the way a lot of this should take place. If somebody is saying you are a Navy officer and you are not allowed to attend a church attendance, even if they follow the same kind of rules of the CDC, then obviously something is wrong. And the bottom line is, there is. And the Navy backtracked very quickly after a letter that came from First Liberty. And then, of course, while we're talking about the Supreme Court, the New York prosecutors want access to Donald Trump's tax returns. So I'll talk about that as well. So we've got lots to cover, some from the Supreme Court, but also a little bit on the pandemic and much more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Antifa is a group that is supposed to be anti-fascist, but actually shows the very characteristics of some fascist groups as well as anarchist groups. As a recent editorial in the Washington Examiner explained, Russians used a similar tactic many years ago. The Soviets coined the term anti-fascism as a way to distinguish themselves from Bolshevism. That way they could gain the approval of many credulous Western democracies. It conveyed the idea that Stalinism was not opposed to the needs and values of the people in free societies. It gave cover to the communist ideals, especially when it was offered as a false choice to Nazism. Both then and now, it provides a powerful propaganda value. Implicit in the idea is that if you don't sympathize with an anti-fascist, then you must be a fascist. And when they take to the streets to fight racism, greed, or corruption, you must be on their side. But the riots over the last few weeks have shown Americans the dark side of this group. The totalitarian mask is slipping. You know, President Trump has been criticized for defining Antifa as a domestic terrorist group, but I ask you to tell me what you would call a group that uses violence to intimidate others in order to advance its political cause. If you don't like the term terrorist, then perhaps the term violent activist group might be your choice. But either way, the designation of Antifa as a terrorist group, frankly, is more rhetoric than precise definition. Antifa is a loose affiliation of activists willing to wear black hoods or masks in order to use shared tactics and targets. Police and local governments have been unable to quell the violence Antifa has brought to a protest or riot. That's why President Trump and the federal government felt that it had to step in. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, once again, let me just mention at the bottom of the hour, we're going to be talking with Don Shenk about the Tidal Global Radio Ministry, which has just been an incredible outreach in India in particular, at a time when sometimes Christians are being persecuted and the rest. They're, in many cases, through this radio program, hearing the message of the gospel, and it's really changing what is happening there. So we'll talk about that with him in just a minute. But our good friend John Stone Street today had a piece that came out called Supreme Court Affirms Religious Institutions Are Allowed to Be Religious. I love that line. And he talks about the first case, the Little Sisters of the Poor versus Pennsylvania. Third time a group of nuns visited the nation's high court, and the latest installment in their 10-year battle against the contraceptive mandate. A regulation that was issued in 2017 gave them an exemption. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the Supreme Court upheld that, and the opinion was authored by Justice Clarence Thomas, who said for over 150 years, the Little Sisters have engaged in faithful service and sacrifice motivated by a religious calling to surrender all for the sake of their brother. But for the past 7 years, they, like many other religious objectors, have been participated in the litigation and rulemakings leading up to today's decision, have had to fight for the ability to continue in their noble work without violating their sincerely held religious beliefs. It is, to me, amazing that people wanted to force nuns who are not engaged in sexual activity to actually fund everything from contraception to abortion and not even see the irony of that. Talk about having bad optics. But the second one they talk about is, of course, Our Lady of the Guadalupe School, which had 2 teachers that, again, were let go simply because of poor performance, including failure to follow basic educational expectations. And again, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that the school had the right to make those decisions, and I think we would all agree with that. Unless you're just a militant secularist, you would say, of course they should. That's what this school is all about, to uphold the kind of theology and doctrine that's going to be taught there. Let's move away from the Supreme Court for a minute, but I'll come back to it when we get to Donald Trump's tax code, tax forms, and everything like that. But while we're talking about religious liberty for another few minutes, it seems to me that we have a very good and positive ruling from the Navy, and that is there was these restrictions placed upon individuals in terms of the coronavirus, policy to allow members to attend houses of worship after chaplains and religious liberty individuals were explaining that and complaining about that. So the acting Undersecretary of Navy put out a memo which actually has clarification of guidance related to attendance at religious services, and the acting Assistant Secretary of Defense issued guidance on that. The statements that are there are all service members assigned to Navy units must continue to follow force, I guess that's what it's called, health protection protocols, such as maintaining social distance, use of face covering, should be choose to participate in religious services or visit places of worship. This change applies to those service members within the continental United States that remain on HIPCON-C. And then you have also the major assigned to the Navy Command requesting the religious accommodation, which was provided. The reaction from our friends at First Liberty, Mike Berry, who is the general counsel that works in the military area, celebrated the clarification as a major victory for the Constitution and religious freedom within the military. He said, "We're grateful to the acting undersecretary and naval leadership for righting this ship and to the commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, for making religious liberty a priority. This memo means tens of thousands of our brave service members will be able to safely and freely exercise their religious beliefs." Once again, we see that there has just been this kind of tendency that every time somebody says, well, I want to keep our people safe, whether it's people in the particular state or the community or the city or whatever, or in this case, people in the Navy, will just ban church services. And you're going, well, you're not banning all sorts of other things. And as Kelly Shackelford has more than one occasion pointed out, how is it that you can catch the virus at a worship service, but you don't catch the virus at a liquor store or at a marijuana shop or at the grocery store or at a Home Depot? And that's when I think many people start saying, okay, maybe we overreacted a little bit. And good news, without any kind of lawsuit, just a simple letter, that took place. Okay, another 7-2 decision which went against Donald Trump, although for those that are making a big deal about it, I think, as you will see in just a minute, it really is not going to have any political consequences right at the moment. But indeed, the Supreme Court, in this decision, allowed the New York State prosecutors, that's Cyrus Vance Jr., right, to actually have access to President Trump's tax returns, even though it has shielded a trove of his financial records from Congress. So the justices upheld the Manhattan District Attorney subpoena and wanting to get 8 years of Donald Trump's financial records, but they also declined to grant Congress access to the records subpoenaed by a number of these House committees. The reality is this. Although I'm certainly going to quote from the president in just a minute, who said that he was a victim of political prosecution, but he was not being prosecuted in these cases. But nevertheless, the issue is, even though it would be seen as a victory for the district attorney in Manhattan, it's not really a victory for Congress, and it really isn't a defeat for the president, because by the time this works its way through the courts, the November election will have come and gone. So I don't really have much of a dog in the hunt here, but nevertheless, I've always felt that an individual running for the presidency should release his or her health records and his or her tax records. Is it a good idea for a campaign? No, I can't think of too many times where releasing the tax records have been positive for a candidate. Maybe once we found out how much money George W. Bush gives to charity. But most of the time when we get these tax records, you find out that, first of all, they're not very generous. You find out that they made a lot more money maybe you thought they made. You find out as people start digging that they invested in this 401k or they have this money in this particular firm, and maybe a subsidiary is something that we wouldn't agree with, and maybe they didn't even know that at the time. And so there's really nothing gained out of that. And of course, one of the reasons I suspect that President Trump, or back then candidate Trump, didn't want to release those is he recognized when you invest in so many different areas, you can start saying, well, this was something in Russia and this particular Russian group invested here, and you start building a case for nothing. But it certainly can create a tremendous amount of fog in terms of the conversation. So nevertheless, the president was furious over this. He complained that he was a victim of political prosecution. He wasn't being prosecuted, so that's the case. It did hand a victory to the Manhattan District Attorney, but it really doesn't do very much, because I always like to try to find somebody that we know whose position gives us some perspective and who's in a maybe common sense helps us out. And one of the attorneys for Donald Trump is somebody who's been on this program with us many times before, Jay Sekulow. And Jay Sekulow said, quote, "We are pleased that in the decisions issued today, the Supreme Court has temporarily blocked both Congress and the New York prosecutors from obtaining the president's financial records. We will now proceed to raise additional constitutional legal issues in the lower court." So you can go to the Drudge Report today and think that this is the end of the Trump administration, that everybody will have a chance to see Donald Trump's tax records. And the reality is, no, they won't. Because by the time this pretty much plays itself out, the election will be over one way or the other. He will either be reelected as president or he will have been a one-term president. And sometime in the future, maybe we'll see those tax records, but I don't think we're going to see them between now and November. Again, the case was decided 7-2, in which you had liberals and conservatives side against the president. The two that dissented were Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. So that's a brief look at some of those. I may recast some of that in the next hour, but in just a few minutes, we're going to be talking with Don Shenk. And if nothing else, this piece that maybe we'll get into more in the next hour has to do with the fact that one of the writers put it this way, and I agree: the world is not experiencing a second wave. It never got over the first. Some 10 million people are known to have been infected. Pretty much everywhere has registered cases. And for every country like China, Taiwan, and Vietnam, there seems to be a number of others like Latin America, South America, maybe even the United States, where sometimes it is raging. And so in some respects, I think we're going to have to live with this for a longer period of time. And if nothing else, for those of you listening in the state of Texas, no Texas State Fair. And for the Republicans out there, doesn't look like there's going to be a Texas State Republican convention in Houston. Everything's being canceled. As a matter of fact, I'm doing a conference in Hawaii by Zoom. Not going out there to speak, just going to do it by Zoom. Let's take a break, though. We're going to talk about some of these radio ministries, and I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. That coming up right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347 5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME, pointofview.net/time, or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
For the next few minutes, I want to focus on some, if you will, really the power of radio, if you really want to get down to it. And, of course, you're experiencing the power of radio right now because you're hearing this interview. But just imagine how radio can be used in other countries to reach across barriers, oftentimes when there's a fair amount of hostility towards Christianity. And if you've listened to any of the conversations we've had over the last couple of years with Open Doors, one of the surprises to me has been the rising amount of hostility to Christianity in India, which now has made it in their top 10 list. So that is something I thought we might want to talk about as well, as we wanted to feature the Tide Global Radio Ministry. You can go to our website, and we have a link to thetide.org, so you can find more about the global ministry there. And to help us understand some of that, the director of Tide is Don Shenk, who is an individual who grew up with missionary parents in what back then was called Rhodesia. Later, of course, came to be known as Zimbabwe, and has been a teacher at the Bible school there in Zimbabwe, as well as a teacher in a variety of different locations, Bible institutes, academic dean, director of student ministries, and the rest. But joins us now by phone to talk about some of the outreach that's taking place right now through the Good News Hour radio program in India. So, Don, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be with you.
Talk about, I mentioned India. Maybe we should start there, although, of course, you're broadcasting in a variety of other places. But it seems to me that, especially where you're broadcasting, it's been a place where there's been kind of a targeting of Christians and an attempt to really obstruct the Christian message. Kind of give us a sense of what's going on right there.
Yeah, we've been broadcasting in India. We first started there in 1978 with Hindi language programming. And it's an area where even today, almost 40 years later, there is still very few Christians. And to understand a little bit of why the persecution takes place there, you have to look at the history of India as a nation.
Yes.
That whole region, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, used to be an English colony. It was under English control. And when they were given independence back in the 40s, they kind of chopped it up by religion. So what is Pakistan today was Western Pakistan, and there was Bangladesh was Eastern Pakistan, because they were primarily Muslim. And then India was primarily Hindu. So this was all chopped up, and basically another word for India another name is Hindustan.
Yes.
Which you don't hear that a lot, but it means the place for Hindus. So they feel it's very much part of their national identity. And even though there were Christians there when independence was granted, no homeland was given for Christians. And so to this day, they are still seen as outcasts or trespassers there in some way.
Wow. And they have actually, even in one of those places there, enacted anti-conversion legislation. And even apart from just the government persecution is just the fact that you'll be harassed, threatened, discriminated against, and sometimes even martyred. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and now to be fair, we have to, that anti-conversion legislation is our terminology.
Of course.
The Indian government would tell you that it is freedom of religion legislation. So their Freedom of Religion Act does say that you can choose your religion. However, why it comes across as anti-conversion legislation is the language in the act makes it very clear that there can be no type of inducement. You can exist. We exist. We are registered as a Christian organization, as a religious organization in India, because we're currently producing programming in 8 different languages there, and we are declaring the gospel there. But we are not allowed to make efforts to convert, to cause someone to renounce one religion and adopt another. And it has specific language in there that says you can't use any kind of force, any kind of fraud, or any kind of inducement. And when it talks about force, it actually mentions in there to make any mention of divine displeasure would be termed force. So if you mention the prospect of hell, that would make you liable for contravening the act of religious freedom by saying that God could be displeased with you if you're not a Christian.
Yes. Well, let's talk about the good news because, we can focus on the persecution. We certainly do with Open Doors, Voice of the Martyrs, and others. But the Tide is really an attempt to have a good news hour radio program and talk about that because this, I think, is an opportunity to not only present it in one language, but if I understand, you broadcast in 8 Indian languages?
Yes. We broadcast in 8 Indian languages. And we are not taking any kind of a North American program here and translating it and trying to contextualize it. What we are doing there, we have a studio at our headquarters in Odisha, which is one of the states where Christian persecution is actually highest. But we work with indigenous pastors so that we help them produce a program in their own language. So they're preaching the gospel. They're sharing what God's done in their own hearts, with their own people, in their own language. And people respond to that because now they're hearing it from someone who they recognize. This is one of our own people sharing a personal God who has touched his life. So it doesn't come in as a foreign element, but it comes in as God who speaks my language and understands me in my situation. And without any kind of force, fraud, or inducement, they hear of a God of grace and love who understands them, and the response is phenomenal.
Well, let's see if we can talk about that, because I've got some examples that were provided to me of an individual that said, I'm listening to your radio program every week and getting peace and joy in my life. Your Bible lesson also gave me more information about Jesus Christ and his love. Thanks for helping me to know Lord Jesus Christ. Now I've accepted Jesus as my Savior. Those are the kind of notes you like to get, aren't they?
Yeah, and those are all, we have a full-time staff and some part-time staff and volunteers that we have there in India. With 8 languages, we have to have a significant number of people working together to translate those letters and send them to us. They are the ones, though, who are responding directly to the listeners and doing the discipleship. So we have the boots on the ground to follow up with the listeners, because so many of them, and that letter that you read there, he said he's accepted Christ. We get a large number of letters where they're saying, I'm really enjoying this program. I'm getting peace out of it, or I'm getting a benefit. I want to know more about the living God, or I want to know more about Jesus Christ. So they need that follow-up. They need that next touch, and that comes from the boots on the ground, whether it's inviting them to attend a seekers conference or discipling them through correspondence, providing Christian literature, and getting them engaged in a correspondence course in their own language that helps them to understand what it really means to be a Christian and live the Christian faith.
Just before we take a break, let me just mention that we have a link to thetide.org, and this is maybe the first time you've heard about this, and if you'd like to connect up with them, get involved, follow their blog, give to them, we have a link there to the website, thetide.org, and if nothing else, when I come back from the break, I thought, Don, we might talk a little bit about other places where you are broadcasting, because we talked about India, and if you use the Open Doors number, that is the 10th most hostile country, India. But then further down, number 12 is Nigeria. Number 32 is Nepal. Number 33 is Bhutan. Those are places where you broadcast as well. So I thought we might talk about some of that as well, so that people get a full understanding of the exposure and the impact that you're having. Because as I think we all well know, it is much more difficult to get American missionaries or missionaries even from other countries into places like India and Nigeria and a variety of others, although I might say that I am aware of people in each one of those countries who are not official missionaries but are there. So that does take place. But it again brings us back to the incredible power of radio. You're listening to a radio program right now. Just imagine if this was your sole understanding of the Christian gospel, if you had certainly been hearing all sorts of myths and mistakes and misconceptions about Christianity, and then you turn on the radio and hear this and hear the gospel for the first time, you can see the impact. So we'll come back from the break. Don Shenk will be with us. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening in some of these other countries, how you can be involved, and how you can support this vital ministry right now to those who find themselves in some of these persecuted countries. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Don Shenk with us. We talk about the Tide, and if you'd like to know some more, thetide.org is a place to go, and let me encourage you to check that out. Maybe, if nothing else, as you're listening to this, you might want to pass some of this information on to maybe the pastor who is overseeing missions, or maybe you have a interest in what is happening in some of these countries, or you know that you're going to be having a mission outreach in India, Nigeria, Nepal, wherever it might be. And I think if nothing else, that would be just a great opportunity for you to connect up with this incredible organization that is using radio to touch hearts on shores worldwide, which is what you find when you land on the website. Don, this, if we can, of course, we've been talking about India. Maybe there's a few other comments you want to make there, but whether it's India, Nigeria, Nepal, Bhutan, you've got some great examples of how radio is having an impact in some of these countries, which in some ways really are closed to the gospel in the traditional sense. But you can't stop airwaves, and that's just been a great outreach opportunity, hasn't it?
It has. And, they always say, radio is the missionary that can go across any border, can go into any home, unhindered. And it is true, whether it is in India where, and there I could give you examples of people who will tell you their lives were, village pastors who will tell you their lives were literally saved by radio because they can walk into a village and if they stand and preach the gospel, they have been beaten or threatened with death. But if they walk into a village with a radio and say, hey, who wants to sit down and listen to the radio, they can get a group of eager people who sit down, and it's a much softer way carrying the gospel in. Plus, in some countries, people can listen in the privacy of their own homes, or with cell phone technology now, especially in Nepal, we have a lot of listeners who they have radio tuners in their cell phones, and they will actually record the programs and share it. And that's one of the ways especially during this global pandemic that we're all dealing with. WhatsApp has been an incredible benefit, just being able to send out messages through WhatsApp and people pass that on. And it's just a message. For those who might be listening and don't know what that is, it's a very popular messaging service in a lot of other parts of the world. Sort of a social media type, but people just pass things on. And it's amazing, even in countries where the infrastructure is poorly developed. For example, Zimbabwe, there's no persecution there, but the economy is just in a terrible state, and people can't even buy radios. But cell phones are dirt cheap. We way overpay for our cell phones here in the U.S., but in a lot of these countries, you got into places you think these people are living in poverty, but they've got cell phones.
Yes, amazing.
And getting the gospel to them, and they just soak it up because here's hope. Whether they're being persecuted, whether they're struggling to survive because of economic issues or whatever it is just amazing how they respond to the hope of the gospel. And I sometimes wonder if here in America we're just too rich, if that's why the church isn't growing as well here. If we're just too satisfied with what we have.
Yes.
That's a story. That's a discussion for another time.
Well, it's a good discussion, but I might just mention, as I look on your website, 9 countries, 27 languages. And so, as you said, I mean, it's not just India, but in Nigeria, which is always a threat. And as a matter of fact, one of the people in my Sunday school class went over there to establish a seminary, and you got threats from Boko Haram. You've got threats from some of the radical Muslims, the sheep herders, and others. That is a place where Christians are facing persecution. In Nepal, they face some persecution, but what I found from my friends that have been to Nigeria or Nepal, sometimes you go into villages and they don't even know anything about the gospel. I remember this one individual was in Nepal talking about Jesus, and finally they said, well, we want to meet this Jesus. Which one of you is Jesus? I mean, just the category that I don't have for that. And what, again, is the value is radio, even putting on their cell phones, is an opportunity for them to hear the gospel in ways that almost are difficult because either of the persecution in Nigeria, or can I mention the geography of Nepal and Bhutan? Some of those places are just really hard to get to. So these are just incredible ways in which we can spread the gospel literally around the world using radio.
Yeah, and they're hard to get to, and as you mentioned, the gospel has not reached there, and it's amazing the number of people that have not yet heard the gospel message. But we have that opportunity to take it to them, and that's why our goal is to continue growing, to get more languages. Once we can get a believer in an area that can help us share the gospel on the radio, it really increases the number of people who hear about Jesus, and the church church planting that can take place, especially in the countries of India and Nepal. Bhutan, you mentioned that one. That is the hardest for us to get into because they are very, very closed. Fortunately, and here's where we need to embrace the concept that missionaries are not just North Americans going to other countries, but we have to send in missionaries from India into Bhutan because they can get visas or access to cross the border, where for North Americans it's very difficult. But the support of radio ministry is, for me, it's critical even in these days where we have so much other technology, and we are branching into that. We do use Facebook and some of the internet technology, but out in the poorest, our mission is to really go where there's a great need for the gospel, where it hasn't been heard or isn't readily available. And for many of those, it is in areas where people still listen to radio.
Very good. We've talked about COVID-19, and you have two ideas. One is to pray for 19 minutes, and so there's a daily prayer guide and a way to get involved. Of course, there's a blog there as well. Or to give $19, donating $19 to Tide Global Ministry. Helps you reach, 380 people with radio programming, and 100% of the donations go to buying airtime. So we have a link to the tide.org. There's a place where you can click on the projects, the events, the blog, how to get involved and how to connect and how to give. So I wanted to make that available because I would imagine for some people, Don, this is the first time they've heard of your ministry, and we wanted to give it some visibility.
Well, we appreciate that very much. I think, I've had people tell me that there's no other area you can get the biggest bang for your buck than you can through radio. And, to reach 300 people with $19, that's basically we come to that number because we look at our listening audience and say, for every dollar we spend, we have the potential to tell 20 people about Jesus. And so that, and many of them have never heard about Jesus.
That's just incredible. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on the program. We have a link to your website. And for those of you traveling right now, maybe you don't have a chance to click on that button, but when you do later on, it's on the website, pointofview.net, or you can click on the picture of Don Shenk. It'll take you to the tide.org. And I really want to encourage you to be involved. As he said, a large bang for a small buck, and $19 or whatever you might want to do, I would hope you would do that. So, Don, thank you for joining us, and let's do it again in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Love to come back.
We are going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to be in our national hour. Then we'll spend some time, first of all, talking about a couple of the Supreme Court cases, and I'll get into a little more detail than I went to this hour, and we'll also talk about this issue of the pandemic and what that means for us in the future. And then James Hirsen will be with us. The Church of Woke will be one of the conversations we'll have with him. Steve Baskerville will be with us at 2 o'clock, so we just have a lot to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Thursday edition of Point of View. We've got a lot to cover over the next couple of hours, and I hope you'll stay with us through the entire conversations that we have. First of all, let me just say that I do want to get to a couple of the Supreme Court decisions today that had to do with Donald Trump's tax returns, and I'll try to explain that, but not maybe go into too much detail. Then we'll backtrack a little bit to some decisions that came down yesterday by the Supreme Court, which also relate to religious liberty. And I'll just give you kind of a brief overview there, because I suspect that Kelly Shackelford and Lathan Watts will want to talk about that tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. And I might just mention that we also have some other people joining us as we'll be talking about that as well. So there'll be a lot of things that we will cover, perhaps even in more detail tomorrow. Also, I want to talk about the fact that many people are starting to say, this pandemic really is here to stay. I want to give you some facts and figures about that. And then we are going to spend some time at the bottom of the hour talking with James Hirsen. His article is The Church of Woke. And in addition to the one he wrote, there's also a very good piece that came out today by Victor Davis Hanson on the fragility of woke. So we'll get into that. And then in the next hour, Stephen Baskerville will be with us. He has a piece called Conservative Diffidence and the Political Exploitation of George Floyd. We'll also talk about the cancel culture, one of the articles I've posted by John Stossel, fired for speaking the truth. So there's just a lot going on, and we will do our best to cover some of it this hour or next hour. And if we don't get to some of it, and we almost never do get to everything, we will certainly hope to cover some of that on Friday. And Jackie Deason, as I mentioned, will be with us as well, with not only Kelly Shackelford and Lathan Watts. But the Supreme Court decision that came down today, if you read all the headlines and hear all the doom and gloom, you'd say that this was a tremendous defeat for Donald Trump. He actually reacted that way, but I think as we get into this, you'll realize that it really has no significant consequence to this political campaign. And the issue is simply this. Let me just come out by saying that I think anybody running for office, whether it's president of the United States or whether it's your governor or your senators, I think it just makes sense. It's just good practice to release your medical reports and your tax returns. Tells you a lot about the individual very quickly. I can see why individuals don't do that. Bill Clinton never released his health records. We suspect we know why. Donald Trump has not released his tax returns. Again, I figure we know why. He's probably got some things in there that would just be an attempt time and time again to find some connections. And if you've ever had your tax returns published, you can see how somebody who's trying to make an issue out of it can say, well, you invested in this 401k, you invested in this company, or your house has this much of a lien on it. You can always turn almost anything into a negative. And I can't think of too many times in which presidential candidates who have released their tax returns came away saying, well, that was a real positive. It's always been a negative. Maybe the one exception that comes to mind is when we saw George W. Bush's tax returns, we said, my, he's a very generous individual. But most of the time, it's just the opposite. We find out most of these individuals talk about being concerned about the poor and don't give a dime to it. But that's okay. The justices today upheld the fact that the Manhattan District Attorney, that'd be Cyrus Vance Jr., is his subpoena actually is going to be upheld, but it's going to have to go back to the court. So the possibility between now and November that you actually would see Donald Trump's tax returns, I think, are slim and none. It also, at the same time, declined to grant Congress access to records which were subpoenaed in an effort to supposedly determine whether or not there was any issue of ethics or money laundering or susceptibility to foreign influence. So the bottom line is what you end up with is a situation in which, even though the president today, in his tweets, complained about him being a victim of political prosecution. Sorry, Mr. President. No, you were not prosecuted. This was simply an attempt to get tax records. So that's an overstatement. But at the same time, this particular article then quotes from somebody we've had on this program many times before, Jay Sekulow, who, of course, is quite the expert at the American Center for Law and Justice, an expert on church-state issues, but, of course, right now is the attorney for Donald Trump. And he said, "We are pleased that in the decisions issued today, the Supreme Court has temporarily blocked both Congress and the New York prosecutors from obtaining the president's financial records, will now proceed to raise additional constitutional and legal issues in the lower courts." 7-2 decision on both of those. The only two dissents were Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. You had both conservative, quote, justices and liberal, quote, justices all agreeing that he has to turn over his records. This has caused a lot of people to say, well, this is the end of the Trump campaign. No, it's not. I mean, it really isn't even close. Although, I'll admit, you go out to the Drudge Report, you go to a lot of these various mainstream media reports, and this is a terrible defeat for Donald Trump. And it kind of brings me to this piece by Rich Lowry. No, Donald Trump isn't going to drop out. You know, I love what he says here. After he's repeatedly survived the unsurvivable, we're supposed to be that President Donald Trump might quit the presidential race before it truly begins because of negative polling. Of course, you could add to it due to a decision by the Supreme Court. And, of course, the point is he said, even if you are convinced that he is down, he said, good luck convincing him he's going to lose after he survived the Access Hollywood tape that had Republican office holders deserting him in droves, after he prevailed on an election night when many people closer to him thought he was going to go down to defeat. Do you happen to remember that? There were a couple of various surveys that were done on election night that gave Donald Trump 1% chance of winning, who sat in the Oval Office the last 3.5 years. So I don't think he's stepping down. But anyway, that's kind of the argument being made right now. So I thought we'd mention that real quickly. When we come back from the break, we'll also talk a little bit about the religious liberty cases that came down yesterday. One of those has to do with Our Lady of Guadalupe, which was a 7-2 decision, which basically said, without getting into all the legalese, that if you have a religious school, then a religious school should be able to choose its religious leaders and its teachers, and if they disagree with you theologically, or even if their behavior contradicts the views, you have a right to determine whether or not you're going to issue them another contract for the next year. The second decision was the Little Sisters of the Poor. Yes, that one again. These poor Little Sisters of the Poor have been over almost a 10-year period fighting an issue that each time you think we've had a resolution from the Supreme Court or a resolution with regulations established by the Trump administration in 2017 or 2018, nope. And this one surfaced because the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the state of New Jersey sued against the regulations, and once again, the Little Sisters of the Poor were victorious. So a lot of great victories on the issue of religious liberty from the Supreme Court. And when we come back, I'll also talk about one of these victories that really helps those in the Navy. But before we get to that, I do want to just make a few comments about this pandemic. If you haven't been paying attention, everything's been canceled right and left. You know, I live in the state of Texas. The Texas State Fair has been canceled. The Texas State Republican Convention in Houston has been canceled. And I think it's an illustration. We're in this for the long haul. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that from some very good articles that have surfaced right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Antifa is a group that is supposed to be anti-fascist, but actually shows the very characteristics of some fascist groups as well as anarchist groups. As a recent editorial in the Washington Examiner explained, Russians used a similar tactic many years ago. The Soviets coined the term anti-fascism as a way to distinguish themselves from Bolshevism. That way they could gain the approval of many credulous Western democracies. It conveyed the idea that Stalinism was not opposed to the needs and values of the people in free societies. It gave cover to the communist ideals, especially when it was offered as a false choice to Nazism. Both then and now, it provides a powerful propaganda value. Implicit in the idea is that if you don't sympathize with an anti-fascist, then you must be a fascist. And when they take to the streets to fight racism, greed, or corruption, you must be on their side. But the riots over the last few weeks have shown Americans the dark side of this group. The totalitarian mask is slipping. You know, President Trump has been criticized for defining Antifa as a domestic terrorist group, but I ask you to tell me what you would call a group that uses violence to intimidate others in order to advance its political cause. If you don't like the term terrorist, then perhaps the term violent activist group might be your choice. But either way, the designation of Antifa as a terrorist group, frankly, is more rhetoric than precise definition. Antifa is a loose affiliation of activists willing to wear black hoods or masks in order to use shared tactics and targets. Police and local governments have been unable to quell the violence Antifa has brought to a protest or riot. That's why President Trump and the federal government felt that it had to step in. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In fact, once again, just mentioned again at the bottom of the hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend James Hirsen. His piece that we've posted, The Church of Woke, and we'll also maybe focus a little bit on this fragility of woke, which was a Victor Davis Hanson piece. But before I get to the Supreme Court decisions, which we'll probably cover in more detail tomorrow, this piece that came out recently in The Economist was a good example of some of the concern that we're facing, because basically, once you get past the opening paragraph, the writer said the world is not experiencing a second wave of the pandemic. It really never got over the first. Some 10 million people are known to have been infected by this coronavirus. Pretty much everywhere has registered cases. For every country such as China, Taiwan, and Vietnam, which seems to be able to contain the virus, there are more in Latin America and South Asia where it is raging. Others, including the United States, are at risk of losing control, or in much of Africa in the early phase of the epidemic. And of course, Europe, they say, is somewhere in between. And so the argument they're making is the worst is yet to come. Based on research in 84 countries, a team in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology reckons that for each recorded case, 12 go unrecorded, and that for every 2 COVID-19 deaths counted, a third is misattributed to other cases. Now, this is a good point, because you're hearing people make the case, and I think you can make it both ways, that sometimes we have individuals recorded as having COVID-19, and there have been duplicate counting. I've certainly found that to be the case, and I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow when we get into this in some detail, because there are some good examples in which they have overcounted those cases. And then when we talk about deaths, there have been some that said we're overcounting the deaths because there is a difference between dying from COVID-19 and dying from COVID-19. But this is looking worldwide. And when you look at worldwide, there's pretty good evidence to suggest that we're missing even some of the deaths. So when you see the death totals, you can put a question mark on it for two different reasons, but that is the case. They go on to say then, without a medical breakthrough, it seems that the total number of cases will climb to about 200 million to 600 million by next spring. Now, again, we're looking worldwide, not just the United States. And at that point, between 1.4 million and 3.7 million people will have died. Even then, well over 90% of the world's population will still be vulnerable to the infection, more if immunity turns out to be transient. We've talked about this. So the point we're making is that I think we're going to have to settle into this for the long haul, and that is the case. They go on to say that the actual outcome depends on how societies manage the disease. Here's the news is better. Epidemiologists understand how to stop COVID-19. You catch it indoors, in crowds, when people raise their voices. The poor are vulnerable, as are the elderly and those with conditions. How do you contain the virus? 3 different ways. Changes in behavior, which I think we're going to have to change our behavior, testing, tracing, and isolation, and if those fail, lockdowns. And they argue that the worse a country is at testing, and many governments have failed to build up enough capacity, then you end up falling back on things like lockdowns. So if nothing else, this was just a sober reminder that when we start looking around the world, this is going to be with us for quite some time. And sometimes we only tend to look at what's happening in our own country, maybe in our own city, in our own state. But I think this is sort of a broader view that would be important. And when we talk about changing behavior, this was a really ominous paragraph in this article as well, because they said changing social norms is hard. Just look at AIDS, known for decades to be prevented by safe sex and clean needles. How many times back in the 1980s, early 1990s here on Point of View, we talked about that. Yet in the most recent year, we have records, 2018, 1.7 million people were newly infected with HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. COVID-19 is easier to talk about than AIDS, but harder to avoid. Wearing a mask is chiefly about protecting others. The young, the fit, and the asymptomatic are being asked to follow tedious rules to shield the old and the infirm. So if nothing else, this is just kind of a reminder that when people react against masks or social distancing or whatever it might be, this is probably going to be lasting for quite some time, and we're seeing one event after another being canceled. I was supposed to be finishing up speaking in upstate New York at Word of Life this week. Here's where I am. Next couple of weeks, I was supposed to be at another speaking engagement. I'll be right here. I have no idea what's going to happen to this one I have scheduled in October in Oregon, but I got a feeling it's going to be canceled too. And I am doing a conference in Hawaii by Zoom next month, but that's about it. And so it has changed everybody's lifestyle, including even those of us around the table. Real quickly, though, let's talk about the very significant decisions that, first of all, Our Lady of Guadalupe School basically argued that indeed you have a right as a religious school to choose those people who are going to be in positions of leadership and influence. And, of course, the argument that was trying to be made is, as well, that might apply back in the 2012 Hosanna Tabor case of ministerial exception, but I think it applies there as well to this. And so that decision was a very positive decision for religious liberty. The second one, the Little Sisters of the Poor out of Pennsylvania, the same issue I think relates to that. And I've also taken the time all also to publish and to post a very good piece by John Stonestreet, who reminded us of how the Little Sisters of the Poor over 10 years have had to fight this battle time and time again. And Clarence Thomas, in his decision, said, well, over the last 150 years, the Little Sisters have engaged in a faithful service and sacrifice, motivated by religious calling to surrender all for the sake of their brother. But for the past 7 years, they, like many other religious objectors who have participated in the litigation and rulemaking leading up to today's decision, have had to fight for the ability to continue in their noble work without violating their sincerely held religious beliefs. So that one was a victory for them. And, of course, the other one, which was a 7-2 decision on Our Lady of Guadalupe School, which again says that if indeed you disagree with the teachers because of, in this case, poor performance or failure to follow educational expectations, you cannot bring a suit against those particular religious groups. Just before we take a break, one of the other cases has nothing to do with the Supreme Court. And I'm glad, because this one, I think, illustrates why groups like First Liberty Institute are so vital. And that is, you had these orders put out in the Navy which would not allow service members to attend houses of worship after chaplains and others had maintained that these would follow CDC guidelines and be safe. And so, as a result, a letter was sent from First Liberty. Michael Berry, in particular, I think, was part of that because he actually has worked in the military, was a JAG, and also, of course, now works with First Liberty. And so the acting Undersecretary of Navy put out a memo yesterday, which actually says, the subject line says, clarification of guidance related to attendance at religious services. It said that all service members assigned to Navy units must continue to follow health protection protocols, such as maintaining social distance and use of face coverings, should they choose to participate in religious services or visit places of worship. And so this was a case that was brought up. It was a case that was quickly resolved, and as a result, Michael Berry, who is with First Liberty Institute, celebrated this as a major victory for the Constitution and religious freedom within the military. His direct quote is, "We are grateful to the acting Undersecretary and the naval leadership for righting this ship, and to the Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, for making religious liberty a priority. This memo means tens of thousands of our brave service members will be able to safely and freely exercise their religious beliefs." So this has been a very good week for religious liberty, whether you are looking at Supreme Court decisions that have come in the right direction, or even a decision from the Navy about what can or cannot be done by service members. So you should be very encouraged, and I'm suspecting that tomorrow we have Kelly Shackelford and Lathan Watts, and then a little bit later we'll be talking with Jackie Deason and others that will be talking about some of these religious liberty victories and what that might mean. When we take a break, though, we're going to come back and spend just a little bit of time talking with our friend James Hirsen. His article is The Church of Woke. We'll talk about this idea of, in some respects, we almost have a religious fervor going on right now, this belief that indeed you have to follow these woke ideas. But as we go into break, let me just mention that we still have our $100,000 matching fund on the table, and we certainly do need to hear from you. We want to have that all taken care of by next Wednesday, and so if you have not had a chance to visit the website, go and visit it. Click on that button that says Give Now, and we'll talk more about that right after this.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
We now continue our conversation with James Hirsen. He's been on the program with us many times before. Business and expert, international business attorney, news analyst, cultural commentator, social media scholar with not only a law degree, but a master's degree in media psychology. He's been the law professor at Trinity Law School for years, journalism professor at Biola University. And as well, of course, he's been sort of our eyes and ears sometimes in Hollywood because he's a lifetime member of the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, active member of SAG, as well as an individual that has worked as a professional musician. So, James Hirsen, always great to have you on the program.
Always great to be with you on this slow news time.
Yes,
there's nothing to talk about.
Nothing to talk about. We have posted your piece, The Church of Woke, and then I also, just because Victor Davis Hanson has one on the fragility of woke, thought that might be a nice companion piece. But let's talk about this for just a minute, because everybody in the world is looking for meaning and significance. And so, obviously, Christians look for that in the church, but you're calling this, if you will, the Church of Woke. It's really, in a sense, become almost a religion. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, sure. I mean, we seek the transcendent. We're hardwired that way, and I know you're a believer. Those of us that believe life has purpose and that it was created know that there's a yearning for a connection with God. So something is going to come and substitute for that yearning if it's not the real faith. And that's what Bob Dylan basically sang about when he said, you got to serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, you got to serve somebody. So we have this entire generation of young people that have been brainwashed by academia in really Marxist thinking and thinking of relative morality. And it's based on the idea of atheism. It's based on an atheistic world. It's based on a world of matter in motion and an accidental world with accidental life and with creatures that basically are automatons that don't have free will, because you can't have free will in an atheist universe. So that's a little too much for people to hold on to. So they search for a substitute for religion. And what's happened is, these groups that have come together and appeared on our television screen protesting and looting and rioting and burning and stuff, they have their own sort of religious doctrine that they've incorporated. They even, for example, I mean, Judeo-Christian tradition talks about original sin. But there's a form of original sin that basically comes from birth. And it's called white supremacy and white guilt. And it has nothing to do with anything a person has done. It only comes from being born. And then they have to do some sort of form of penance. They have rituals where they take a knee. They have their own form of indulgences where corporations, for example, seek to alleviate guilt through money. But that's also part of church history as well. And so the real tenets of this Church of Woke, and this is, of course, embraced by the BLM organization, the Antifa organization, is based on this hatred for what they see as systemic evil. And they at least acknowledge that there's some kind of evil in the world, although they don't have a way to really account for it. But their way of getting rid of evil in America, because it's systemic, because it's embedded in the system, is to tear the system down. And I think that's the great misunderstanding that these corporations have. They view the entire Western civilization as being evil, that the ideology of Western civilization has an evil systemic quality, and therefore the only thing to do, it can't be fixed. It really can't be changed. It must be destroyed. Therefore, you see these people jumping up and down when they pull down a statue, or they burn down a government building, or they destroy somebody's dream by burning down their business. And I have to say, as bad as I do think those acts are, and they're criminal acts, and Americans have been appalled watching them occur in real time on their television devices and such, as bad as they are, these mayors and governors are just as bad.
Yeah.
Because knowingly they have facilitated crime. They are not just aiders and abettors, or the law calls accessories to crime. They are enablers because they ordered, instead of doing their duty and protecting their citizens as they're required to do, is one of their fundamental duties, they ordered law enforcement away. They ordered fire departments away and allowed property to burn, allowed people, innocent people, to be beaten with bats and skateboards. I just, I've never seen anything like it. And so they're kind of the bishops of the Church of Woke. And my hope is that, that just, by the way, for your listeners, I mean, people throw around this term woke, but what it refers to is this hyper radical thinking that really has arisen in the age of President Trump. There was no notion of, woke plots. As a matter of fact, in Hollywood, where I work and live during the day, there's a maxim that's come into being: if you go woke, you go broke. Because this political ideology gets put into valuable entertainment franchises and destroyed, as almost the Star Wars franchise was destroyed. And the entire entertainment business is suffering from this disease of woke.
Amazing.
To the point where those projects that are still alive, that haven't been killed by hyper-political correctness, are just infiltrated with shoehorned left-wing ideas that aren't organic and natural, the way the kind of stories that human beings resonate to normally would be. And so it's a very bizarre time that we live in, very end-timey, isn't it?
It certainly is. Let me just, for real quickly, because we're going to take a break and we'll come back afterwards, but get your initial comments, because one thing that you typically find in a religion is forgiveness, but this Church of Woke really doesn't have that. I mean, if indeed you are born with white privilege, yeah, you can bend the knee and you can do a number of other things, but I do get the sense that there is really no sense of forgiveness, and that's something that a lot of these companies that have tried to send money to Black Lives Matter movement, or tried to, in one way or another, kowtow, don't seem to understand. Even the mayors don't understand, because the more you give, the more it's perceived as weakness, and the more that you're going to lose in terms of that interaction with the Church of Woke.
Yeah, because they have no Judeo-Christian moral standing, so it's more like Nietzsche, where might makes right. And you're absolutely right. There's no redemption. There's no forgiveness. Instead, there's a cancel culture.
Yes.
Which is capital punishment in terms of a person's reputation, using the social media, which we just had a group of prominent left-wing liberal celebrities, including J.K. Rowling and Noam Chomsky and others, sign a letter.
Yes, that letter.
Cancel culture, because they are becoming victims of the cancel culture. But that doesn't change. The cancel culture looks for one flaw in the past. It can be very old, and then the person is labeled a bigot, and their career is canceled.
I might
Which
just
is
mention we're
part
going
of
to
the
take a break and get into that maybe in the next hour, because I do have this very good piece by John Stossel, Fired for Speaking the Truth. And some of these go so far back. And, of course, a statue can be taken down for any reason. I'm not sure why Stevie Ray Vaughan and some of these get to pull down, but nevertheless, we'll get into that in just a minute. But we're talking today with James Hirsen. His piece on the Church of Woke is available to you. And when we come back, I might just pick out real quickly Victor Davis Hanson, The Fragility of Woke, because some of these individuals that are part of the cancel culture, some of those are pulling down statues, you think they're really tough. Turns out they're pretty fragile. And, of course, we've talked about that in other conversations, especially in our conversation about the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. We'll come back and talk a little bit more with James Hirsen about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, James Hirsen with us. And again, I commend to you this very good piece on the Church of Woke. But I thought I'd also pull in one that Victor Davis Hanson talks about, because he starts out by talking about this individual, which I'm sure you're familiar with. You might have seen the TikTok video. This Harvard graduate who threatened to stab anyone who said all lives matter. And then the next scene, you see her almost in the fetal position crying and talking about how this is just so awful. And I think that it was just one illustration of the fact that as he goes through this, as you have these individuals pulling down monuments, it's almost amazing when somebody stands up to them, when somebody who is a governor, a mayor, or maybe just an individual that's in St. Louis that pulls out his AR-15, all of a sudden some things begin to change rather dramatically, and now you're seeing some of them terrified of having an arrest on their record or concerned that they may be going through various videos to identify them, and they might in one way or another get charged with a felony. So there is a sense in which there's a great deal of fear and a lot of cowardness. But James Hirsen, it seems to me that one of the best ways to respond is deterrence, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. That's why I think it's a great idea that the president directed the Justice Department to go out there and, because a lot of this stuff was on video, and use technology, and they've arrested hundreds of people and charged them. And once that began, I think, it's not gone, but it's certainly rolled back from where it was at its most intense time when we were watching Minneapolis and seeing an actual precinct police station taken over and burned. And the stuff that was condoned by these mayors and governors was just way, way beyond the pale. And a certain portion of these demonstrators are really people from middle class and upper class homes. They're students or they're graduates of prestigious universities who've had their minds brainwashed. And yes, they're not used to having to deal with any kind of tough circumstances. They arrested one of the leaders of the Jazz Chop occupation, also called Autonomous Zone in Seattle. And this person was crying, literally crying tears, a male, as they caught him. And it may have been due to an injury, but it didn't look like that. It looked like he was just turning into a baby, if you will. And we saw in St. Louis several hundred people. They were threatening to murder this couple, to murder their pet, and without firing a shot, just with brandishing weapons as the Second Amendment allows them to do, the crowd dispersed and melted away. Now, unfortunately, this is how topsy-turvy things are. An activist prosecutor, probably put into office by George Soros organization money,
yes,
came out and said that she was not going to prosecute the people that threatened to murder, that broke down the gate, that were trespassing, this mob, but instead prosecuting this couple for defending their property and themselves and their lives. So far as I don't believe anything has happened, but this is when I talk about the extreme so-called virtue signaling, and how it's come back. In the world of entertainment, we have people that never expected to become victims of cancel culture, and but all of a sudden, with hyper-political correctness, they did. Most recently, the actress Halle Berry.
Yes.
Who
there's a
was
good example.
Attacked on social media because she did an Instagram interview or video post where she was at a beauty shop or something, and talked about how she was and she was virtue signaling at the time. She was considering taking on a role where she would play a transgender, and to which the transgender movement began to attack her for some sort of appropriation. No, she should let the real transgender actors and actresses play the transgender roles. And Halle Berry had to come out and apologize for a ludicrous wrong that she had done. This had happened a few years earlier with Scarlett Johansson, who was going to play some role like that, which is, over the years in Hollywood, who's very much for any kind of alternative lifestyle, there were a whole series of movies where actors played either transgenders,
Oh, sure.
transitioning
Yeah.
people.
Mm-hmm.
Dallas Buyers Club. There was one on made for cable called Transamerica. Jeffrey Tambor. There was Jared Leto, Felicity Huffman, and all of a sudden now that's not allowed anymore.
It switched. Yep.
And the cancel culture steps in and threatens this cancellation, and we have the unseemly strange kind of virtue signaling where people want to say, no, I'm not a bigot, I'm not a sexist, I'm not a transphobist. And it got to the point recently where Lady Antebellum, a group of liberal singers,
Can't use the word
decided-
antebellum. Yep.
yeah, Antebellum will be offensive, so we're going to go Lady A. So they hired a lawyer to sue a blues singer who's been using it for 20 years to prove they're not racist. They're going to harm an African-American blues singer
It's just
so that they
pathetic.
can use the name Lady A.
Yes.
And they ought to. So, I mean, that just shows how crazy, insane that this hyper-political correctness has gone to.
Well, again, the book, or actually the article, I should say, The Church of Woke, although we could write a book about it, is available. And if you'd like to know more about James Hirsen, and of course, we post some of your articles from time to time, but I'm glad we could catch up with you for a few minutes and get your perspective, because you've always been helpful for us to understand what's going on in Hollywood. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. And I look forward to the next opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Kerby.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much for joining us today. And we're going to take a break. Let me just mention that if you wanted some good information, the Church of Woke is one that we've posted. My July 1st commentary called The Liberal Blacklist gives you some of the details about J.K. Rowling and others who find themselves, even though they're the liberal progressive types, if you just stray just slightly off the progressive plantation, oh boy, it comes to you in spades. But let me, just before we take a break, give you an update on our matching fund. Many of you may remember that about, 2 weeks ago, we had Foster Freeze on here, and he said, you know what, I want to give you a $50,000 match to encourage people to give to the end of our fiscal year. And then we had somebody else add to that, so we actually had a $100,000 matching fund. Now, to his credit, Foster Freeze said, you know, rather than have it end on June 30th, I'll have it go to July 15th, which is next Wednesday. So I thought I would just point out that even though we have this $100,000 matching fund, we haven't quite achieved it yet. We're at $83,677. So that means we still have about $16,000 remaining between now and July 15th, which, by the way, is tax day. Hope you get your taxes in. So between now and next Wednesday, we still need to make up about $16,000, because I really would like to be able to tell Foster Freeze that we met the match. So this is a good time. If you have not given, it's a dollar for dollar match. $100 becomes $200, $500 becomes $1,000. If you can help us out, visit the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking with Dr. Stephen Baskerville, and we have posted his article, Conservative Diffidence and the Political Exploitation of George Floyd. He is the author of such books as The New Politics of Sex, The Sexual Revolution, Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Government Power, Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Marriage, and Family. He's a research fellow at the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society, and as well the Independent Institute. Has a PhD from the London School of Economics, has been a professor of government at Patrick Henry College as well as Howard University. And Dr. Baskerville, it's just great to have you on the program with us today.
My pleasure to be here.
Let's, if we can, maybe get to your article. This comes from the New English Review. I love how you start. Why does it go on year after year, 30 years after the riots that followed the beating of Rodney King, and a half century after the riots following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., decades after the Civil Rights Movement, desegregation, the Great Society, the decades of welfare before that, even 8 years of an African-American president, it still continues. Let's talk about that, because was really, in a sense, trying to make sense of what we find ourselves in, and we have tried on this program to address everything from police accountability, structural changes that can take place, the issue of race, racial reconciliation. So what might you want to add to this conversation that has developed over these last couple of weeks?
Well, the point of the article was partly to fault. I find fault with both the left and the right on this. On the one hand, it's simply not plausible, as many have commented. It's not plausible to suggest that all of this is simply the result of racism. It goes on year after year. We have affirmative action programs. We've had all these anti-poverty programs. It simply isn't plausible. But I think conservatives are also at fault. They have not offered any alternative. There are serious problems in the black community. But they're not problems primarily of racism. They're problems of family structure. We've known this for decades. We've known this since the Moynihan Report of 1965. And yet, year after year, these problems continue. Conservatives should be much more aggressive. Those who stand for family values, those who stand for religious faith, should be much more aggressive and proactive in pushing this fact, because it's incontrovertible that this is the cause of these problems. And more than that, it's a problem that can be solved. It's not something that we just throw up our hands and say, oh, the family is breaking down, as if it's some kind of impersonal forces. It's not. It's welfare programs and other government programs that are almost intentionally breaking down the black family.
Let's, if we can, go back to the 1960s. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, later, of course, became a U.S. Senator from New York, but he was warning the Lyndon Johnson administration then that this very phenomenon, which we see now, more and more children, both now, not only just in the African-American situation, Hispanic-American, even Anglo families are breaking down because children are born without parents, without a father in particular. And the consequences of that, Dr. Baskerville, have been very significant, haven't they?
Absolutely. And as you say, it's not limited anymore to the African-American community. The white majority community is about where the black community was when Moynihan's report came out in the 60s. So it's spreading. And we've seen today that problems of crime, addiction, truancy are not primarily associated with race or with poverty. They're associated primarily with family breakdown, fatherless homes. And these fatherless homes are caused by two factors in particular. One is the welfare system,
which, as you say, the Great Society of the 60s made the problem worse. It didn't make it better. And the second factor that's causing this is the family court system and the divorce system, which allows judges and social workers and others to simply remove innocent, perfectly fit and willing fathers to be fathers to their children.
And so, again, let's, if we can, be hard on the conservatives for just a minute, because I'll be willing to admit that, just the other day we had Colonel Alan West on talking about that. I can think of Larry Elder and all sorts of other people on this program who are African-American spokespersons of some sort, obviously on the conservative side, who have talked about the breakdown of the family. But it does seem to me, like you said, we got to do more than talk about it. So are there plausible solutions? After all, you work at the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society. What could be done to begin to turn that around in the right way?
No, there's some very concrete things to do, and they're politically, well, they're really very simple things, although it'd be quite politically difficult. One is we need to examine the welfare state. This has been going on for decades now. The welfare state has made the situation much worse, not better. And so we need to much more serious welfare reform than what the Clinton administration undertook in the 90s. The second one, though, is that a lot of the spread to the middle class in particular and to the larger communities has been done not through the welfare system, but through the family courts and the divorce system, which allows fathers, for the most part, sometimes mothers, to be simply thrown out of their families without any finding of literally no fault of their own through the divorce system. And there's been no discussion about this since no-fault divorce came in the 70s. Conservatives and Christians have been very lax and very, as I say, diffident about taking this on. And I think there's a real concrete reason for this, and that we are, in both cases, the welfare system and the family court system are really put in place in many ways by alliance of the legal system and the government bureaucracies, but also by the radical feminist movement. Both of them were part of the feminist agenda for decades, going back to the 40s even. And unfortunately, conservatives are very afraid and much too diffident on taking on the radical feminists, who are the ideological movers of both the extreme welfare policies and the extreme family court policies.
Might just mention we've posted this article, Conservative Diffidence and the Political Exploitation of George Floyd. And Dr. Baskerville, first of all, we have a lot of Christians listening to this because we're primarily on Christian radio stations, but not exclusively. And you asked the question, where are the Christian groups that claim to be pro-family at the very moment when such principles could make a visible difference? It seems to me that whether you're part of a Christian organization or whether you're just part of a church, it seems to me that this is something that churches and pastors and Christian leaders should be talking about, and what might be some things that they could actually preach from the pulpits or from the podiums in America.
Oh, you're exactly right about that. They should be crowing from the rooftops, because of the problems we have associated with the black family are a vindication, and the white family are a vindication of all of the things Christians have been saying for years about family breakdown, about the absence of Christian faith in the home and in the community. And yet, when this breakdown translates into very concrete social pathologies, Christians are silent, and it's like they're afraid to raise these issues. We have family organizations, so-called, focus on the family, and then the Family Research Council, and yet they do nothing about the welfare state or about the family court system, about the divorce system. They simply don't take it on at all. And you're right, churches even more so. We abdicate. The churches kind of abdicate their responsibility to these Christian law firms, these pro-family organizations, and they do a lot of good work. I don't deny that. But congregations and churches and individuals and families we need to act like citizens, like Christian citizens, and not abdicate our citizenship to paid law firms. It's not enough to send $100 a year to the Family Research Council to focus on the family and think that they're going to take care of the problem for us. Churches are ready-made organizations, community organizations, that exist for that purpose.
Yes. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to talk about. And again, this article, which I think is really kind of a blockbuster article by Dr. Stephen Baskerville. It is entitled Conservative Diffidence and the Political Exploitation of George Floyd. And you can find out more about that by going to our website. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Antifa is a group that is supposed to be anti-fascist, but actually shows the very characteristics of some fascist groups as well as anarchist groups. As a recent editorial in the Washington Examiner explained, Russians used a similar tactic many years ago. The Soviets coined the term anti-fascism as a way to distinguish themselves from Bolshevism. That way they could gain the approval of many credulous Western democracies. It conveyed the idea that Stalinism was not opposed to the needs and values of the people in free societies. It gave cover to the communist ideals, especially when it was offered as a false choice to Nazism. Both then and now, it provides a powerful propaganda value. Implicit in the idea is that if you don't sympathize with an anti-fascist, then you must be a fascist. And when they take to the streets to fight racism, greed, or corruption, you must be on their side. But the riots over the last few weeks have shown Americans the dark side of this group. The totalitarian mask is slipping. You know, President Trump has been criticized for defining Antifa as a domestic terrorist group, but I ask you to tell me what you would call a group that uses violence to intimidate others in order to advance its political cause. If you don't like the term terrorist, then perhaps the term violent activist group might be your choice. But either way, the designation of Antifa as a terrorist group, frankly, is more rhetoric than precise definition. Antifa is a loose affiliation of activists willing to wear black hoods or masks in order to use shared tactics and targets. Police and local governments have been unable to quell the violence Antifa has brought to a protest or riot. That's why President Trump and the federal government felt that it had to step in. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Stephen Baskerville and his book, The New Politics of Sex. I wanted to pick up on that for just a minute because one of the things I thought was most arresting in your article is if you wonder why the American police sometimes seem so brutal, there's a group that's pressuring them. And then you make the connection to some of the women, very radicalized women, that were the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'd never really put all that together. So help us out, because that's just another aspect of this conversation that we need to have, isn't it?
Well, that's right. Yeah, this is one of the subterfuges that they're pulling off here with Black Lives Matter and with the radical left. They're presenting this as a movement of black liberation. But in fact, the moving spirits behind it are radical feminists. Radicalized women, and they, of course, the left-wing mythology is that this is all a progressive coalition of black nationalists, feminists, homosexualist ideologues, and so forth. But in fact, these phenomena are not comparable. These movements are not comparable. The movement for women's liberation, at least the more irresponsible wings of it, the radical wings of it, have wrought horrible devastation in the black community. They've promoted single parenthood, single motherhood. They've professionalized the social work industry, which has become a kind of a series of kind of family Nazis in many ways, Bolsheviks, who detest fathers and look for any opportunity to remove them from their home. They're heavily ideologized, the social work industry nowadays. And it's, the idea that women and blacks should join hands together in this movement of progressive liberation is simply a fallacy. There's no movement that's had more devastation on low-income black and other minority communities than the women's liberation movement.
And one of the things I think is so interesting is I've in many cases said to our listeners that we've posted various articles on why you should be concerned about some of the people behind the Black Lives Matter movement. But I've oftentimes said, just go to the website, and the first thing you're going to see is a lot that has nothing to do with black, white, or race or anything else, to dismantle the cisgender privilege, to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. I think anybody going there expecting you're going to have talks about affirmative action or trying to lower any kind of barriers to integration of various kinds of groups into society or helping with job training are going to be really struck by the fact that most of the manifesto has more to do with sex and feminism and radicalism, doesn't it?
That's a very good point, and it's not an accident either, because they know that, well, in many ways, the sexual left is the vanguard. They're the cutting edge of the left today. Racial nationalism is not nearly as powerful. And this is a problem, again, I fault conservatives on, because conservatives don't hesitate to take on racial militants, people like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, and these are not dangerous opponents. It's fairly safe to criticize them, but there is a fear of criticizing the feminist movement, the Me Too movement, and so forth. They've very skillfully maneuvered themselves into a position where they make a big show about concern about violence against women and domestic violence and these sorts of things, and it's struck fear into conservatives and Christians. It's made them terrified to criticize these groups. But in fact, again, they are extremely destructive. There's no place. The breakdown of the family has had horrible consequences on minority communities, and it's having terrible consequences on the majority community. And until we have the courage to bite this bullet and take this on, these problems are just going to get worse and worse. And this is why, as I say in the article, it's not gotten any better in 40 years, 50 years. It's gotten worse.
And one of the things that you say in this particular article is the late Phyllis Schlafly, used to be on the program with Marla Maddox and with Penna Dexter, myself and others, identified a lot of this as a fear of feminists. And then you go on to argue that not only does this address this issue of maybe not taking on Black Lives Matter movement, but maybe not even taking on the hashtag Me Too movement or a variety of other issues, some of which we talked about just a few minutes ago when we were talking with our friend James Hirsen.
Absolutely. No, Phyllis Schlafly was a prophet in that respect. She saw this back in the 70s. She saw what was going on. And she, in one of her recent books, she made these connections in her book called The American Family. She made precisely these connections. And unfortunately, she actually had opposition from within her own movement. I worked with Phyllis Schlafly in the last years when she was took on the family court system and began to criticize the system of divorce and child custody. And she found that even within the conservative movement, she came across opposition to this, which I think made her very sad. But she was very clear about that. In fact, the word that I used to hear come out of her mouth quite often when she was referring to male Republican politicians was cowards.
Yes. Well, let me just, before I run out of time here, first of all, encourage people to get your article, which we have from the New English Review, Conservative Diffidence and the Political Exploitation of George Floyd. But also on our website here have a link to StephenBaskerville.com. You don't even have to know how to spell it all because we've got it right there. It's your internet site. And so if people wanted to know more about some of the things that you've written about, the new politics of sex, sexual revolution, civil liberties, and the growth of government, taken into custody, the war against fathers, marriage, and family, as well as some of the videos, some of the articles, and those kinds of things. That website is available, but talk about some of the resources there, because some of the listeners may be saying, I've never heard of you before, and I'd like to know more, and I'd like to read some of your articles. So what will they find when they land at your website?
Well, quite gladly, yes. I have published two major books on these topics in the last few years, and they'll find information there on excerpts from the books and what they're about. And they will definitely help you to think outside the box on these issues. They're not the usual cliches about the breakdown of the family and the horrors of divorce. It goes into the politics very deeply. I was trained in political science, and so these are the first books that have analyzed these problems from a political science standpoint. And there's quite a few articles on the site also. Some of them are from academic journals, but I assure you they're not stodgy or esoteric. And some of them are from current affairs journals like the Crisis Magazine or the Daily Caller. And they will explain to you a different perspective on what's going on today, both with sexual politics and sometimes with racial politics as well.
You know, again, I've oftentimes said sometimes when people are hacking at the branches, they need to be cutting at the roots. And I think in some respects, what you are doing is getting down to some of those base issues. So let me first of all commend to you this piece, Conservative Diffidence and the Political Exploitation of George Floyd. And then second of all, we have a link to StephenBaskerville.com. And I think you're going to find that in some respects, he's really identifying an issue that we've talked about here on the program, but need to come back to again. And for those of you that are in positions of leadership, maybe in your church or in your political arena, you might want to take some of this and apply it appropriately. So, Dr. Stephen Baskerville, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure. God bless you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll get into a couple other issues. You know, when we talked about that cancel culture with James Hirsen, one of the articles I've posted here is by John Stossel, Fired for Speaking the Truth. This has gotten out of hand, and you have individuals actually speaking the truth, saying truthful things, losing their jobs. Now, again, the cancel culture may not affect J.K. Rowling as much as others, and you can go back to my July 1st, the idea of the liberal blacklist and those kinds of things. So some may survive, but there are really good, honest people that have been doing work that deserves attention, and instead, by even asking a question about Black Lives Matter or raising a question about this or maybe providing an alternative viewpoint or providing some statistics, that's enough to get them fired. And so we're going to talk about that for just a minute, and we'll get into a couple other issues in the news. We've talked about Antifa or Antifa, however you want to pronounce it, and that's my Viewpoints commentary today, so we'll get into that as well. But as you go to the website and maybe even find this particular article by Stephen Baskerville, you'll also see that we have a banner there for our $100,000 matching fund. And again, if you're with us 2 weeks ago, we had Foster Freeze provide a $50,000 match, which he said he would allow to go to July 15th. I'm grateful because another individual wanted it finished by June 30th, and we met that one. So we have now, the total is $83,677, which means we need about $16,000 left. So between now and next Wednesday, if you would like to join with us, I hope you would, we have a dollar-for-dollar match, which means if you have a gift of $100, it becomes $200. A gift of $500 becomes $1,000. And let me hasten again that if you've lost your job or you cannot help us, don't feel obligated. I just want to encourage you maybe to tell us your circumstances so we can pray for you. But we're hoping some of the others that are listening and have benefited from some of these conversations would step up and help us out. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after these important messages.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We put lots on the table here today. We've had a chance to talk about the Church of Woke. We've talked a little bit about some of the religious liberty cases that have come down. Of course, the whole issue of whether or not Donald Trump should release his taxes and all sorts of issues like that. We've spent some time talking about what was called conservative diffidence and the political exploitation of George Floyd, and really probably more critical of conservatives than even of the progressives. But again, we recognize how some of these various crises are used to advance an agenda. So lots to talk about. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But one of the other articles I've posted is by John Stossel. I thought it was a good summary of what I'm starting to see. And let me just mention that we'll give you, I think, 3 examples of people that, maybe more than, now that I look at this, of people that have lost their jobs or have been part of the cancel culture. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, as you've heard people say, because what we have right now is a feeling on the part of people that are liberal, progressive, politically correct, that they can actually push people around and they can use their influence to get people fired and do this with impunity. And this is the kind of thing that you do when you think that you're on the right side of history, when you are convinced that you're not going to meet any kind of significant opposition. And as you heard me mention when we were talking with James Hirsen, this very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, The Fragility of the Woke, all you have to do is kind of push back a little bit. As you may have learned when you were a kid in grade school, that the bullies aren't quite so tough when you push the other direction. But let's just take on one of the stories that John Stossel talked about. It's entitled Fired for Speaking the Truth. And he said the online mob came from Harald Uchlig, and as you might imagine, he looks from one of the Scandinavian countries. And so the question that John Stossel asks is, what terrible thing had he done? And he says, as I show in my new video, he tweeted, Black Lives Matter torpedoed itself with its full-fledged support of hashtag defund the police. Instead of defunding, Uchlig said, train them better. That's pretty normal, pretty non-controversial, wouldn't you think? Oh, no. Hundreds of people then signed a petition to demand that this professor at the University of Chicago and head of the Journal of Political Economy resign. Now, this is no small person. This is no insignificant person. This is a person that I would assume was a tenured professor. I don't know that for a fact, but I assume so. And also the editor of the Journal of Political Economy, pretty prestigious journal. And so then you even had prominent economists like Janet Yellen and Paul Krugman join the mob. And so Paul Krugman, of course, New York Times, said he's just another privileged white man who evidently cannot control his urge to belittle the concerns of those less fortunate. And, of course, as John Stossel said, but that's just a lie. He wasn't belittling the concerns of anyone less fortunate. He was raising the question, wouldn't it be smarter that instead of promoting the hashtag defund the police, you might do what we've been talking about here? Can we do better training? Can we have better accountability? Should we rethink police unions? You know, all the stuff we've talked about for actually now almost a month. But nevertheless, Reason Magazine, Robbie, editor, said there is nothing racist or discriminatory in how he said it. But again, this is an editor, Robbie Sovak, I think is his name. But he says because we have these so-called woke protests, remember those things we just talked about a minute ago with James Hirsen, there is a different view from the protesters that he must be racist. So ultimately, the University of Chicago, as far as I can understand, placed him on leave from the journal that he ran. And so John Stossel goes on to say the new totalitarians demand that no one criticize their view of the world. The online mob even attacks its fellow Democrats, and you probably have seen this before. David Shore is an analyst for the Democratic polling group called Civics Analytics, and he tweeted a study that concluded that race riots reduced Democratic vote share. This study was probably accurate. Can you imagine if you're watching a race riot and then you're going, okay, some people just go say, I don't want to be a part of that, so they don't vote. And so he's giving some statistical evaluation that once we've looked at cases which we've had race riots, and I mentioned just a few when we were talking about the introduction to the article by Stephen Baskerville, that then you see a drop in participation. That's the issue. And so, again, the study most likely was accurate, but that maybe just wasn't what the politically correct mob wanted to hear. So the mob attacked Shore, and one tweeted, "Come get your boy." And his bosses did, even though he issued a groveling apology. He was fired for saying something as simple as race riots reduce Democratic vote share. Yep, probably do. Okay, here's another one. There's a cruel streak in activism, comes from the editor there at Reason Magazine. If you disagree with me, you have no right to speak. Why are they winning? The argument is ridiculous. Again, the argument is people are afraid to challenge them. It just takes one employee at one company to say, here's the law that protects my rights to feel safe and comfortable in this workplace. If you're not making me feel safe and comfortable, I'm going to get you in trouble. So cowardly corporations cave. Here's another example, as if you needed more. A Boeing executive was even forced out of the company for opposing women's service in the military 30 years ago. Remember we talked with James Hirsen just a minute ago? Sometimes they'll go back, in this case, go back 30 years ago. Now, I remember 30 years ago because that's when the real question was at the time when you had the incoming president, Bill Clinton, arguing for women in the military. And here, this executive, maybe 30 years ago, had questions about women servicing in that part of the military. And so he was forced out of Boeing for something he said 30 years ago. Which brings me back to a point I make with James Hirsen. You know, most people in America are pretty forgiving. Christians are pretty forgiving. We recognize that somebody might have made a mistake 30 years ago. Somebody might have had an opinion 30 years ago, changed their mind. That's okay. But you can see how there's no forgiving anymore, because once we find a flaw, that's enough to tear down your statue. That's enough to tear down your career. That's enough to get you fired. Here's another one. A Los Angeles soccer team fired a player because his wife posted comments that were perceived as racist. That's amazing. Michigan State pushed out a physicist when a Twitter mob from its graduate employees union labeled him a scientific racist. Okay, what was racist that the physicist, I mean, you're in physics. How does that even come up? And the idea that he rejected the idea that scientists should categorically exclude the possibility of average genetic differences among groups. Okay, so now the culture group has not only gone to this part of the country, it's gone overseas. And of course, the example we have here is the one I use in my July 1st commentary. And that is the author of Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling, has been smeared as transphobic when a tax researcher was fired for saying identifying a woman does not make a person a woman. Rowling tweeted incredulously, force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real. And she said nothing against trans people, but she was concerned about how this was going to affect the feminist movement. And so as a result, they, of course, come after her. And as we point out in the commentary that I did on July 1st and in this article here, now the publisher of J.K. Rowling has had problems because a number of the staff have decided they no longer want to work on any of her books. Some of the actors who appeared in the Harry Potter movies have now come out and spoken out against her. Why? Because they fear what will happen to them. She also, of course, talked about a charity that talked about, people who menstruate instead of saying, no, I think that's women, isn't it? And that by that time then caused them all to say that she's transphobic. She's written all sorts of things saying she's not. And of course, as we pointed out with James Hirsen, now she and Noam Chomsky and really a whole lot of very intelligent and progressive individuals are now publishing letters saying this is getting out of hand. And that, of course, is exactly the case. It reminds me in some respects of the French Revolution. You couldn't just be radical. You had to be more radical. And if you weren't radical enough, sooner or later, you would lose your head. In this case, maybe they're not taking off a person's head, but they're trying to get them fired or ruin their careers simply because they've strayed a little bit off of the radical, liberal, progressive plantation a little too much. Anyway, that's another article I've posted on the website, Fired for Speaking the Truth. It's a piece by John Stossel. You can watch the whole video as well because we've provided that link. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View.
your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that, when you have this cancel culture, there's certain things you can't say. You know what? There's certain words you can't use. Isn't that just amazing? I have been watching this over the years because oftentimes when we have any kind of discussion or a debate or a cultural crisis, it really is a war of words. And in the past, one of the games that I've noticed that has been played so often is to redefine the terms so that even while you think you're having a conversation, you're really not. And, of course, the liberal progressive wing has been very good at this. Abortion, for example, is called choice. Homosexual marriage is called marriage equality. Well, who's not for equality? And so as a result, we have this growing list of words and phrases that have been redefined in order to advance an agenda. But what is becoming even more interesting is now we not only have the redefinition of words, but we have kind of a cancel culture of words that cannot be used. David Hirsen the other day was coming across an article that was in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it had 4 racist words that should be banned from our vocabulary. One of those, it was actually a phrase, eeny, meeny, mighty, mo. I don't even know why that's racist, but okay, whatever. But one of those was peanut gallery. You've probably heard that before, right? Peanut gallery, that's racist. How in the world? No doubt you probably heard somebody say, well, we don't need any comments from the peanut gallery, meaning from, people in the back or whatever. And the article strains to try to argue that this is racist because, and somehow it's linked to a time when people that sat in the back sections of the theater might have been poor people, might have been black people, so then that's racist, saying peanut gallery. First of all, I tend not to use those idioms sometimes because they don't communicate or because you have to be of the right age to even know what they mean. So it's really no skin off my nose if you say eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Then maybe the first time I've ever said that on program, or peanut gallery, the first time I ever said it here. But that's the kind of game that's getting played. But the one that I found showing up and time again, I saw this the other day in the Washington Examiner. I saw it also in this article in the National Review, and that is we can no longer use the word master. Really? Okay, that would be like the master bedroom of a house. Of course, the way it surfaced was from a sports broadcaster saying we have to change the name of the famous golf tournament known as the Masters. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear the Masters, I'm not thinking about master slave or something like that. I do know that at Harvard, they changed the individuals who were the masters of the college to deans, but you still get a master's degree. I've got a master's degree from Yale. I got a master's degree from Georgetown. What do I call those now? I mean, we can't do that. By the way, just for a moment, I've mentioned this before. If our woke crowd wants to really seriously deal with this issue of latent racism, then they really need to change the name of Yale University, which is named for Elihu Yale, who was not only a slave owner, but a slave trader. Does anybody seriously think that Yale University will ever change its name? I don't. I mean, you spent centuries building up the brand of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, whatever. And there is, I've just sort of want to play the game. Until I see you change that name, stop telling us that we need to change the name Masters, for example. And of course, when you think about this, when I think of the Masters Golf Tournament, I think of Tiger Woods, I think of Arnold Palmer, I think of Jack Nicklaus. Arnold's, David Hirsen said, we use master in a lot of different ways. Whenever I've maybe told a speaker or a musician that they did a good job, I oftentimes say that his or her presentation was masterful. We having to get rid of that word. We refer to a painting or a musical score as what? A masterpiece. This is, in some respects, really helpful for the political correct movement, but it's harmful for everything else, because when you start redefining words, when you start banning other words, it makes it more and more difficult to even have a rational discussion. And I'm beginning to wonder if maybe that's the purpose in all of that in the first place. But let me just before we end up with the end of the program here, talk about my commentary today. My Viewpoints commentary, which you can sign up to receive if you'd like, is on Antifa or Antifa, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's anti-fascist, so that's why a lot of people say it's Antifa, because it's supposed to be anti-fascist. And as I even point out, the Russians used this technique years ago. The Soviets coined the term anti-fascism as a way to distinguish themselves from Bolshevism. And that was a way to gain credibility among the West, especially those who were very credulous. And it conveyed the idea that Stalinism really wasn't opposed to the needs and values of people in free society. And it sort of gave them a cover as those who were actually holding to communist ideals. So we're anti-fascist, and sort of offered a false choice to Nazism. Well, if you think about it, it's another good example of using a phrase to advance your cause, because now that anti-fascist Antifa really has kind of tremendous propaganda value, because implicit in this is the idea that if you don't emphasize and you don't sympathize with the anti-fascist, well, then you must be a fascist. And when they take to the streets to fight racism or corporate greed or corruption, well, then you just have to be on their side. But my argument is over the last couple of weeks, we've started seeing the dark side of that group, and the totalitarian mask is really starting to slip. And so the reason I wrote this piece is, if nothing else, the president, of course, has been criticized for defining Antifa as a domestic terrorist group. But again, I just asked you the question, what would you call a group that uses violence to intimidate others in order to advance its political cause? If you don't like the word terrorist, okay, violent activist group, something like that. I don't know what it might be. But again, let's recognize that even though the president has wanted to designate that, this is kind of a loose group of individuals, which is more rhetoric than precise definition. And so whether the attorney general or the president is able to use that effectively, we'll have to see. But right now, it's certainly just kind of a loose affiliation of activists who wear black hoods and masks in order to use what many people call shared tactics and targets. But nevertheless, if nothing else, I wanted you to know that article is there today. My Viewpoints commentary is there. And most importantly, get you ready for tomorrow, because tomorrow will be our Friday weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford with First Liberty will be with us. Lathan Watts will be with us. And we'll have some other conversations a little bit later. So I wanted you to be aware of some of those issues, all front and center on the website at pointofview.net. And just before we walk out today, let's, if we can, talk about a couple things. We do have that matching fund. So if you have been maybe thinking, maybe I should support this organization, seems like it's doing a good job. And I certainly have learned some things over the last few years, or even today. The latest numbers I have, these came in about an hour ago, $83,000. So that means it's $83,600. So we need about $16,300, and if you can help us out between now and Wednesday, which is the deadline, which was established by Foster Freeze, we would greatly appreciate that. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to find some of these articles, you've been quoting from James Hirsen, and you've been quoting from a variety of other guests like Stephen Baskerville, you've been quoting from John Stossel. Well, all those articles and many more are available on our website, so I hope you'll take the time to print them out and maybe pass them out and get some conversation going as well, because then you can multiply the impact of Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition, and I look forward to seeing you then right here on Point of View.
The year 2020 has been filled with problems, or let's just call them challenges. Before I get into that, we want to thank you. We just passed the end of our fiscal year, and many stepped up in a very big and sacrificial way, showing just how much they believe that Point of View is needed as we head into the last half of this year. And that's where our new challenge comes in. At the last minute, a friend stepped up with a surprising $50,000 matching challenge, and listeners matched it. But after that, yet another friend, knowing how important this year is, put down another $50,000 challenge, and because we were so close to deadline, said we could extend it just a bit to July 15th. As our nation deals with so many issues, make sure that Point of View can be a strong voice for truth by helping us complete that second match. Double your investment by giving at pointofview.net/time or call 1-800-347-5151. The clock is ticking. Pointofview.net/time. That's TIME. Pointofview.net/time or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.